I'm so happy you've joined me today, Melanie. Thanks for doing this. And, there's a lot of reasons why I wanted to talk to you today, but I think one of the more interesting things for me, and I don't think I could do as good a job as you, sort of describing your kind of very varied and eclectic background, I think is what makes, this, for me anyway, this conversation so interesting because you're bringing an amalgam of a lot of different perspectives to the conversation. So maybe just for people who are tuning in, just give us a little bit about some of the different places you've been and things you've done, so that they can understand, sort of where all of this is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, David, thank you for allowing me this time to just kind of talk about what I do and how my story and L&D kind of weaves together. But I, like so many, L&D professionals, kind of started in the classroom. So,
Mm.
my undergraduate degree is in elementary education. So I graduated from Grambling State University in elementary education and was offered an opportunity to research, right? To kind of take on a assistantship and pursue my graduate studies around research and education. And, by that time, I had been in the classroom for a few years. I actually enjoyed my time in the classroom. But, really wanting to, in every teacher's journey, there comes this time where, whether you pursue your secondary degree or you're, looking for that next step in your career, it's either going to be in administration, further education as a teacher, and I didn't want to do either of it, right? And so I took this opportunity and went to University of Minnesota, and I kind of went in blindly. I was like, I'm just going to kind of let my career unfold, and fortunately it did in the space of HR education. So and kind of aligned with adult education. So I pursued my master's. I did the research. So my research focus actually took me around the globe to South Africa, looking at the intersection of HR policy and implications in non-government organizations, nonprofits, community-based organizations. And I just loved it. I kind of, you talk about what's kind of eclectic about my background is one of the things that I came into this field really from a research lens, which is not your typical four-year practitioner. So I came at looking at, how patterns connect and listening to the data. What does the data tell us? And, kind of putting it out there into the world. And so fortunately, unfortunately, when it was time to kind of pursue some job opportunities, I went in with that research mindset and it didn't get me very far, right? I was seen as very out of touch with, the way the field works and, really like, yeah, you're really smart, but, kind of need someone that can do the job, right? So I very quickly had to adjust, and it took me a little while to kind of get that lesson. And so, taking kind of some consulting opportunities, along the way, I did some teaching, in university. I did a little bit of, started working on my PhD. And, my opportunities came when I was approached by an organization to kind of build their training program, build a training program for them. And that was a very interesting because you read all these theories, right, in the textbook and you read how, organizations change and all those, but it's one thing to be right in the middle, right? So
Mm.
it's one thing to read about resistance and it's one thing to, experience resistance when you're asking stakeholders about their job and they're questioning, well, why are you here? I don't understand what your role is, right? So to kind of get it in the face. So, and very quickly having to work through those because, okay, you've been charged with creating this program. How do you deal with this, resistance that's there? So, a lot of navigating, a lot of building relationships, some successful, some not so much. And, taking that. So, one of the things I can say that I've really enjoyed in my career has been, kind of building things from the ground up. So hey, there's not much, there's a little bit of a landscape, maybe there's a desire, but we want to take this program from here to kind of here, right?
Mm.
And just kind of getting in and figuring out how to get that done. And so for me, it started off with building training programs, and slowly my interest started to peak into, wanting to look at, okay, yes, training is important, but what about the leaders that are driving? What about the people behind it, right? Not so much the process, and getting more involved in that. And then slowly being tasked with, okay, now how does engagement, impact that? What do we, how do we drive engagement, better engagement through the organization? How do we build culture? How do we now looking at leadership development, succession? How do those things come together? So I've just kind of like grabbed these collected things along the way, and very much like my early research lens, kind of how do they fit together and create this really cohesive story to tell.
I love that. I have a research background as well. Spent a lot of time as an industry analyst doing a lot of research, both interviews and studies and with data and all that. And what I love about that is the way you describe it. What you bring to the table is this constant search for answers, right? You're trying to find
Right.
out stuff, and
Right.
as you were describing all these things, you were describing them in the form of a question. What happens? How does this? Where does that?
Mhm.
And a lot of organizations, they sort of want, I think, especially in the learning function, you're supposed to have the answers, right? You're supposed to come and just tell the answers.
Mhm.
There isn't any discovery going on, which I'm like, well, you can't have the right answers unless you're doing some of that research and discovery. So I think that approach to always trying to find the patterns is a big one for me, right? When you start to see
Mhm.
how things start to connect. So I think, that was why one of the reasons I was excited, because, what we're talking about today is at the top of all of this that you've just described is this continuing discussion that goes on in L&D. Almost every single organization, regardless of industry, regardless of the way they necessarily approach learning or training, they all talk about this. How do we be more strategic? How do we be more of a strategic partner to the business? How do we have more of an impact? But then when you start to dig in, you realize that whether by design, on purpose, against their will, learning is happening in this very siloed function in the organization, and doesn't have a lot of input or output to some of the other parts. And so when you describe it, the things that you're trying to do, the things that you're interested in, you're constantly trying to reach over here, reach over there. How does this work? How does that work? So I think that's what I want to explore with you today, because
Yeah.
I know that people are interested in this because they talk to me about it all the time. How do we
Mhm.
get a more strategic presence in the business? So if you want to just like start talking through some of these other elements of the business and how learning can connect, and how you've had experience in the past being able to connect to make things a little bit more strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I will say one of the biggest lessons, and you're absolutely right. Like, as L&D leaders, we are called upon to be more strategic. Especially with the emerging of AI. I've had colleagues kind of tell me that, much of the work of their team has been kind of condensed because, whether it's instructional design, there are now tools that can do more of those things. But it's also the engine behind AI, which are the people, right? And being strategic. I would say one of the things that's really, I love strategy, period. I love business strategy. So I would say any L&D leader, speak the business strategy, learn the business in and out. How do we play in our market space? How do we, sell our products, right? What differentiates us? And then distilling that down to how do our people, what are the skills needed to drive our strategy? That is kind of one of the top questions when I go into any meeting with an executive leader, a stakeholder is, what are your business goals? How are you achieving them? What's getting in the way? And what role does skills play, right? Because I feel like with that, then we can start to have kind of a line discussion. Oftentimes, and I'm pretty fortunate that I've got kind of this wide tentacle across engagement, learning and development, leadership, and so forth. So I naturally am able to kind of weave those things together, and and that's always kind of been in my career. And I would say, definitely listen to, um, what you're hearing, but then also going a little deeper and saying, okay, if we roll this initiative out, the end user, what are we expecting of them? How does that impact the business, right? And also realizing that change happens. Strategy, kind of changes a little bit sometimes, right? I remember I had an incident with one of our working with one of our strategic partners, on a project. This was a few years ago, and the whole scope of it, kind of changed, right? And we went in a different direction. But being able to know that and being in tune to that hey, the business is now going this direction. You wanted us to partner to go this direction. How does that now change? And so being able to know that and understanding where their pain points in delivering against their strategic goals, how you come alongside them and help them and really advise them. Yeah.
And in those discussions, do you find yourself either consciously or subconsciously? Is there a process in which, this one we're told as learning functions, if you want to be more strategic, you have to think like the other parts of the business, speak the same language. But is there a bit of translation that goes sort of the other way? Like, was you're talking to the stakeholders about what their goals are. Is there a way to translate that into what learning does, right? So like this is how that translates into the learning world. If you want this to happen, we need to do these things. Because I think sometimes there is this disconnect where the business says they know what they want, but they're not really sure how to ask for it. And it's one thing if they can just turn to the learning leader, said, I need this, and then learning does its thing. But I think it's beneficial not only for the learning leaders to understand the language of the business, but for the business to be able to speak that language of learning as well, to say, this is what we need how we need people to change, what kinds of things we need to do. Does that go on? Does it happen enough, not enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to some degree, you do have to understand how leaders empower their people, how they almost kind of will support the learning, right? How they'll empower their people, how they'll empower you, because it's one thing to say, okay, here's what our people need in the business, but then also, they've got to be in a space to make that skill exchange or the acquiring of that skill important, right? So they've got to communicate, hey, we're learning this because we've got this new product. We've got to ensure that everyone is aware of it. We want to be the type of organization that does this. And so therefore, we're going to need to continuously learn this. So, really kind of putting that language in their mouths to understand that, why is this important to learn? Because whether we know it or not, learning is an investment, right? Whether it's a course, whether it's, really time away from the job to kind of experiment. And, oftentimes we have leaders that are just, not just interested, but they're interested in getting the job done. But then so you have to kind of show them to say, yes, we absolutely can do that and ensure that learning is happening continuously, right? Oftentimes I find this when, around career development discussions. So there's the learning piece itself, the skill acquisition, but then there's also like the continuously acquiring of skills and growing careers within your teams, right? Growing your people. And so sometimes that comes a little bit at a risk, as a business leader, you want to ensure that you've got the right people in the job, but it also kind of wraps around, giving these individuals permission to fail in a sense, right? That permission to learn, that permission to try things, and really kind of level setting that they have to set that expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I would agree. I think that's missing a lot. We've seen it in our own research here, even when you get to frontline employees at retail environments. One of their biggest pushbacks that we saw in our research was that we don't have an opportunity to practice these skills they're giving us. And because you're talking high turnover, rapid environments, short onboarding runways, and it's like, so get up and go, and also hourly employees. How do you work this? But then it goes from there all the way up through the leadership development realm of people need to try this stuff out, and there is rarely the opportunity to do that. I think what you're describing is that seems to me to tie in, and you mentioned it earlier about like succession. So the idea that organizations do think about succession and succession planning and how roles are going to fill, but interestingly enough, don't often have enough of a connected relationship with learning when it comes to that. So, what are some of the other aspects? Like you talk about, making sure that the skills that are articulated as what's needed. But what are some of the other things that make learning and succession so intertwined, and how do you ensure that the business is recognizing that relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting. When we start to talk about secession, that takes learning to a completely different level. Typically in a business, when you're looking at your line of succession, whether it's an executive leader, whereas it's in the C-suite, looking at the experiences those leaders have had, many can kind of tell you, what a few areas that that were pivotal for them. Um, but it's difficult to really create like a learning path, right? It is really around what are the key experiences, what are the buckets of experiences that someone has to have. And for some leaders, they have so much insight and experience that they've gathered along the way. There is no learning path, right? It really is, well, raising awareness around this person has just got to experience this at this time in this space, to be ready for what we may not know is ahead, right?
Hmm.
And so I think when we're talking about succession, it is about being strategic, and it's about being super intentional, right? Like, hey, I've got, if I'm a senior director or a VP, how am I going to bring people along and almost kind of bring them along my journey, right? Folding them in. So, almost kind of being this type of leader that is not a top down, but it's also saying, hey, here's how we're collectively learning these together, and almost kind of laying out, as you progress in your career, these are the things that I want you to have experience within. This is a very critical view for you to have as a rising leader within the organization. So again, it's giving them that language too of development to say, calling out those experiences that are going to really enrich someone's growth. And really challenge them, and even in some of the failures, right? Sometimes is we're put in positions and we think we're there because we're just rock stars, and for many for many reasons we are. But there's also this capacity. You've got to know how to fail a bit too, and then to come back from that. And those aren't lessons that are taught in a textbook. Those are
Yeah.
things that are, you're experiencing those things, right? And it takes that leader, and it takes that coach and that leader to say, okay, how do we, that's your agility as a leader, right? That's how you build, and being able to coach and grow through those experiences.
Yeah, the willingness to take that chance. I mean, I look at my own career, and if I go back far enough, the very first time I ever had to speak in public and do a presentation, that wasn't the plan. I didn't think that's what I was going to do. It was just sort of what they would probably call a stretch assignment, right? It was, hey, we
Right.
want you to
Yeah.
do this.
Lots of stretching.
And yeah, and I at the time thought there's just no way I can't do
Hmm.
this, and panicked and anxiety through the whole thing. And then I did it, and it went well, and it just it turned out it was something I was pretty okay at, and I continued to
Hmm.
do it. And it was something I would have never offered. I would have never raised my hand and said, I think this is what I should try. I have
Hmm.
this unique set of, I didn't think I did, but somebody was able to say, you should just try this and just do it, and then you'll know. And I don't think there's enough chances to do that, especially when you're talking about, if you move away from a more day-to-day transactional role, but like that career development, those pathways, you don't know what you don't know. And it takes some courage, both on the individual contributor and a leader, to say, give this a shot. And if it doesn't work, that's okay too. Like, because now
Hmm.
we know, and and
Hmm.
you've got that experience. But people are
Yeah.
afraid to fail, and people are afraid to let people fail, I think, sometimes.
Hmm. Yeah, I've seen that very often. Because it's a risk, for that, senior leader, and it's a risk in reputation, right, or perceived reputation. And for most importantly for the individual, because who wants to be known as a failure? Um, but it's kind of like giving those guardrails, and giving them the language to say, ultimately this is growing you. So any setback is a setup, and so how do we help you to bounce back? That's where you're going to get the most impactful leaders, are those that are able to kind of take those setbacks as learning lessons and very quickly move
Mm-hmm.
forward. What I'm hearing a lot of in the literature is, what separates your high potential leaders, successful high potential leaders, is learning agility, right? Ability to learn, ability to pivot. And so, oftentimes when I set up, some of those discussions around next generation leaders, it is, how quickly can they learn? How quickly can they apply? Even if there's an opportunity to fail there. So
Yeah.
learning agility is a huge piece.
Of course, and I think that just brings it back to why learning should be so integrated into the concept of succession in an organization, because those stretch assignments, the chance to fail, it's not a zero sum. It isn't all or nothing. You either succeed or
Right.
you fail, right? There's this space in between of, wow, I think I've got a feel for this, or this appeals to me. I just need this, and this, so I can be really good at it. And I wouldn't have known that. Nobody would have known that until I tried. So that's where learning is like, okay, yes, we know exactly how to help fill those gaps. And so you start to see this bigger picture. You described, leaders in certain roles, and they just sort of end up there via experience, right? And that's very natural. That sort of happens. But over time, you can start to capture that. And I think, you brought up at the very beginning this idea of AI helping us be more strategic. This is one of the ways I think it helps. Not so much even in that, oh, it takes away a task so I can be more strategic. It's actually using the analysis skills of an AI model to look at different roles in the organization, say, whenever we've had success, this is generally what it looks like. This is what that journey looks like. You need to have this, and this. And learning isn't all of it, obviously, but you can identify where learning is going to get you from here to here, and then maybe here to here, and all those things play out, and they can only work, together, in a sense, to be successful. So yeah, I think you're spot on. If you can, one of the ways that learning can definitely make itself more strategic in the business, people are often very focused on external business goals. Oh, we can help revenue or increase sales. All very important stuff. But something like that, the idea of, oh, we can help the organization be change ready and prepared for the future, and have this deep succession bench, by integrating ourselves into all this. I think that's a great point you make.
Absolutely.
Some of the other areas that you're talking about that I just want to dig into, about how, how learning is integral to them, and then how learning professionals can work towards doing more of that in their own organizations if they're not already. For the first one, it almost seems, when you talk about it to people, it seems like, well, of course, like performance. Well, of course, performance and learning are like this. You can't be better at something unless you learn. But when you actually get into organizations, the processes, the people, and the function of learning and performance are almost completely separated.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, I see it so often. They use a different uh, technology platform to manage the two things, and they have different people who are in charge of those things. And then it's conversations, whether they're annual or weekly or whatever they are. It's between the manager and the employee, or what have you, with little outreach back into learning. So, when in your experience, when you talk about performance as being one of those things that learning has to be integral to, what's been your experience, and then what are the core things that make those things so tied together?
Yeah, I would say, and it goes back to being that strategic partner, right? What does performance look like, to the business?
Mm-hmm.
Also, you have to look at how performance is rewarded. And so that takes a little bit of, building relationship across, some of those areas that, look at performance, how it's rewarded, and so forth. Because oftentimes, people want to see the value, whether it's a growth in role, whether it's, more salary, more, increase. Hey, if I learn something, will this help me grow? Or, if I, teach something to someone, and I've seen this before. Is this person going to take my job? If I train this person on this, does that mean that I'm training myself out of a job? And so I think, from a performance standpoint, you really have to look at how is performance rewarded, what is important around performance, how do people see performance, right? Especially when you're looking at, organizations that might have a, pay for performance, right? You really have to be very clear in how you are helping managers to communicate the way they see performance, excuse me, and the way the employee might see it, right? And so you definitely have to kind of ensure that you're creating this level of understanding around seeing eye to eye. Managers communicating, what you're measuring, how that's important to the business, how that person is helping drive the business, and empowering that employee to ask and being able to be in this space to own their performance, and then bringing learning into that space, right? I think some of the best performance learning kind of relationships that I've seen and that we've really helped managers through is not only being able to articulate what good performance looks like, how that good performance is driving that business, and in some cases how that employee is exhibiting good or the best, and how they can be related, right? And the best conversations also are, hey, when you focused on that skill and you demonstrated that over here, that really made a difference and helped us to grow in this area. So therefore, they're getting this picture of, okay, if I learned something over here, it really helped the business move, which is going to benefit me. And then there's more of that buy-in, more of that engagement. But when you have, sometimes you have leaders that may not know how to, right, articulate what good, what's bad. They're not having conversations with their people, to discuss how they're moving the needle. They might have a conversation, at that yearly performance review. At that point, it's too late because you haven't been able to really articulate, where the gaps are and understand where the gaps are. In my role, I've been able to really push and drive, the one-to-ones. That's the secret sauce, right? Because as managers, you're not only being able to have great conversations with employees about how they're moving the needle, how, rewarding them and, giving them recognition, but you're also understanding where they might have gaps. And that's where the learning comes in too. Wow, you weren't able to execute this in the time that we really needed to because you didn't have exposure to this key piece of learning that may have happened, right? Or we didn't get you, a trial to this. You were left out of this. I didn't think about that. Let's quickly get you caught up. Let's have a conversation in a few weeks and let's see how you're doing with learning this piece so that we can get you, to a space that you're able to contribute at the maximum level. So I think this idea of performance and learning kind of goes hand in hand. And managers, and leaders have an opportunity to really kind of hone in on the and support and drive those. So, yeah.
Yeah, it gets hard because in the actual doing of it, I think sometimes those performance conversations, and things have definitely gotten better over the few years. A lot of companies have moved away from that annual surprise conversation that nobody's really prepared for to the more
Thankfully.
ongoing conversations. Um,
Yeah.
but I think they still tend to be somewhat retrospective, right, for the majority of it, and it has to be. Some part of it has to be like, let's see what happened, right? And then how do we move forward? But I think if you're able to set it up in a way that you're both looking back and forward and learning's role. So, right, you look backward and say, here are some areas where there are opportunities to do better. And learning can help fill some of those gaps for you. But then there's the opportunity to look forward and say, here's what we think should happen over the next whatever period. And things, whether for this individual and then your team and then the organization, and some of the things that are going to help you get there and help us get there are these learning programs, right? That are maybe, put in there. So there's an expectation ahead of time that isn't just like, here's what we want you to do. Good luck. If you don't do it, we're going to figure out how to make it better for you, right? So again, being far more integrated into the process going into that performance process that says, look, here's what we expect of you, but we're not going to just put you out there and leave you, on your own. Here's the support that you have to get there over whatever period of time that is. I mean, is that something that you've been
Yeah.
seeing? You've seen more forward looking?
Absolutely. And then I think too, setting the expectation, because you may have someone that may not be a top performer or may be trending low in performance because they were promoted, right? They've got a new role, they're in a new situation. I'm hearing a lot of, right now I'm following the news with a lot of your tech companies, your Googles and so forth, said, oh, we're cutting our top performers. Well, these could have been people that have taken on new and more challenging assignments. And so their top performance is not going to be reflected, in a previous assignment that maybe they've mastered. So there's that area and opportunity to learn. So I think sometimes we've got to level set how we view performance. If someone is a low performer, looking at what's around that. And then also wellness comes into play, right? There's a whole different, that's a whole different topic area too, is, we bring ourselves to work and sometimes our wellness plays into that as well. But oftentimes we've got to really be able to kind of level set and again, giving managers that language to help them, you know, give
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to see that get better. I feel like the conversation has been happening where for continuous learning, right? The idea of how do we make a
Mm-hmm.
more continuous learning culture, and at the same time, you've been
Yep.
hearing about performance trying to move away from that annual thing. So there is a parallel. They're both trying to move in that same direction where we're constantly, checking in and seeing how things are going. But I haven't seen it really come to fruition yet. It's just because of the legacy processes that are in place. It's very easy to fall into. Let's just meet at the end of the year, and we'll tell you if you got your raise or not, and then we'll move on, right? And it's I don't think the outcomes. I think it's been proven that those outcomes aren't very good as compared
Yeah.
to these ongoing conversations and expectations and support, right? So we sort of talked about this already, I think, in terms of the succession, but then it gets into this other area of leadership, right? Leadership development. And, again, you're talking about developing leaders, so it seems on the surface, of course, that is learning, right? That is a learning process. But I also do, again, noticed a lot of organizations treat them very separately in that, leadership development is for this core group of people that we've identified, and they end up actually it's a smaller audience, but they pour more resources into it because its leadership development is considered much more high touch and all this other stuff. But I've started to see and I've been encouraging this movement to more broad leadership development, right? Like, why are these select handful of executives? Why are they the only ones that need to be critical thinkers or think about things from a design thinking standpoint or whatever the leadership type skill is? So have you noticed that? And you obviously do the research and you spend a lot of time with the literature, maybe even in your own work, where there's a little bit more of a democratization of leadership development, like for more of the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. When I was kind of talking about my background and starting off early in my career, I had the opportunity to work for a adult high school. And, this was an adult high school. These were, um, you know, individuals that the regular high school model, did not fit them. They were, maybe just exiting out of the foster care system and, or a lot of different challenges. I was charged with building a leadership program to build these leaders. Now, these are individuals, like young people that you wouldn't think of as leaders, right? But they're the ones that are the leaders in their families. They are, well respected in, different spaces in their community. And so the idea is let's ready them and give them leadership skills so that when they step into, different organization spaces, they have that leadership mindset. And I've always kind of taken that into that early experience of my professional career into any L&D role focus where I'm charged with building a leadership program, it's yes, we've identified these individuals, and many a times the systems and tools that we use to identify this select group of individuals that we want to focus these resources on, tend to be a little biased, right? They're the ones that agree with us, and they are bought in and so forth. And oftentimes what might be left out are those individuals that see things a little differently, right? They might challenge a little bit. And so absolutely, I've definitely seen this shift from let's focus on a few to let's keep our eyes and ears open for the many. Let's provide the learning opportunities. Let's provide people. Let's have an ear for and an eye for who's interested in solving these problems, leaving it open, and then allowing opportunities. So you're almost kind of letting this leader emerge, and you're offering these skills across your teams and across your groups. I am definitely a skills for all person. I am definitely for enabling leaders to kind of see potential across their groups, across everyone. And you can only do that by providing opportunities for all. So yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, in the experience that you described in the beginning, to me, it's like, yeah, I think you're right. On the surface, there might be many that would write that group off to say, well, this is not where you go looking for leaders. But I think the very fact that they're in an adult high school, it shows that they're actively addressing the issue, right? For so many people, that experience, that high school experience, that education is very passive. This is just how life works. You go through this and it happens, and you're just sort of along for the ride. And now you've got a group of people who found themselves in one situation and have decided I'm going to change that situation. I think that's actually a great pool of leaders, right? And I think the ability to recognize that, just to sort of cast that wider net and start to recognize what are the things we should be looking for that we maybe aren't on our little checklist of who gets this. And I think, again, if you democratize, you make the opportunities available, people start to have an affinity for things they didn't even know they had, right? They sort of start to self-identify. Things pop up that didn't fit the box before. It's again back to your thing about being able to recognize patterns, right? So you have to look for things that either clearly fit the traditional pattern, or maybe we're looking for other new patterns.
Yeah.
Always be looking.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've seen, we might set our strategy, our senior leaders might set our strategy at the, beginning of the year. That is our course. But as we move through, right, shifts happen, geopolitical, market space, all of these things kind of play into shifting the winds in our direction. And so being able to kind of bring, individuals and along that journey is so important.
Yeah, I mean, being ready for anything. I mean, because this thing a phrase that gets used in our space a lot is you'll see marketing materials come out and say, future-proof your organization, right? This, that. And I've always thought, like, I don't know if that's what I want to do. I don't think I want to future-proof anything. It's like, because if something's bulletproof, it prevents bullets. If it's fireproof, it prevents fire. Would you want to prevent the future? I don't think we want to future-proof. I think we need to be ready for the future, and whatever that means, and be able to change it. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what processes and systems you have in place. It's people that are going to help you change and adapt to the future. So yeah, I think we focus so much, and this is the core of our conversation, on how do we get learning to become more strategic. Part of it is helping the business recognize the strategic role that learning plays. Like, look, if you want to be an agile organization, if you want to be able to, handle whatever comes, learning has to be a key part of that, because whatever challenge you face, I say this phrase a lot, no organization is going to hire themselves through any crisis, right? You probably could hire people to fill certain roles, but at the end, that's not going to solve all of it. There has to be a shift in the way people do it. And if companies think, well, nothing's going to be that drastic, you don't have to go very far back to see, the pandemic. No one thought that was going to be what it was. And it
Right, right.
dramatically changed the way a lot of companies do business. Then they're still doing it like that now. And so don't think that there isn't something else like that. around the corner. So, yeah, and the idea that any business could be having these conversations, and they are, without thinking about the development of their people in the center of that just doesn't make any sense to me.
Absolutely.
As we're sort of wrapping up here, one thing I'd ask you to do, if you could, just think about all your experiences you've had, and if there's something that sticks out in your mind in one role or in a certain organization where you really felt like you got it. What was one of those really great moments that exemplifies this strategic role of learning for you? If you could think maybe it's a conversation with somebody in the business, maybe it's a program that was successful, a business challenge that was solved, anything at all that you could sort of share with us.
Oh God, there's been so many.
Well, that's good, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit anomaly. Like I like to be engaged, right? And so, being involved in the business, I like projects that excite me. And I'm fortunate that that is pretty much where I've always. And when they don't excite me anymore, then I'm looking for another excitement, right? I will definitely say, you know, being able to kind of take, oftentimes in L&D, you might come in at the middle of the project, come in, but being able to see, start with something on a napkin and seeing it, a couple of years later, like fully functioning in the business is, has always kind of been my driver. Being able to have some of those. I know several years ago, I led a leadership program. And, what was really exciting about that is starting those conversations with some of those leaders to say, hey, what do we need for our business to grow? What are the leadership attributes, right? How does a leader need to behave? And then going through that process, capturing those and kind of building around those, right? And then seeing that 2 years later, in some business, like it takes time, but seeing those things kind of emerge, seeing those skills and attributes being spoken, being lived, and being, exhibited. And then, looking back to say, hey, we've not accomplished, there's always work to do, but there's also an opportunity to kind of build on what we've kind of laid the foundation. That's been exciting to me in a number of ways, right? I remember several years ago in an organization, I built out a coaching program, right? So, I said, hey, learning, it's not enough that we just teach the skills. We've got to coach, right? For the nature of the job, we've got to provide continuous inputs and coaching. And, looking and seeing, I was on LinkedIn a few, weeks ago and seeing that business is still hiring for coaches, right? Based off of a lot of the things that I've been able to kind of say, hey, this is important. And so I think that is definitely being able to kind of see the things that you started and, have them grow and, in many ways become a part of the culture, right? So yeah, those are the things, growing programs and seeing them live on, and it's like a baby, seeing it grow.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's a great way to bring it home is that I feel like a lot of learning professionals feel a little overwhelmed with the things that they're trying to do, and it feels like, oh, nothing is ever done, right? I can never get any of these things done, and it's that phrasing. It's almost, and it's looked as a negative, like, I can't. But you're saying the same thing from the other side of the coin. It's never done, right?
It's
You're
never
always
done.
building, right? So you do the things. Don't look at it like, I can't wait till this is finished, right? It's the idea of this is the building block to the next, and we're building something. And it's just continuously building. So I think I love that as an idea to wrap this up. And the idea of making learning more strategic. It's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight, and you're just constantly building on all of these things. So, Melanie, thank you so much for sharing. Like I said,
Absolutely. This
all
has
your
been
vast
great.
experience. Yeah, no, I love this. I hope people find this helpful. And again, just love talking to you. And maybe we'll do this again sometime.
I love that, David. Thank you so much.